Hello and welcome to today's webinar, Filling Your Cup, Comprehensive Self-Care Strategies for the Educator. My name is Aaron Macias and I will be your moderator for today. Before we introduce our speaker, I would like to mention a couple of ground rules. As a reminder, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted within 24 to 48 hours. If you have questions for our speaker, please feel free to use your question box on your GoToWebinar control panel. We are committed to providing webinars with thought leaders in education, sharing topics to inspire the best teaching and support social-emotional learning. Opinions and content in this presentation are that of the featured speaker and may not necessarily be a direct representation of Sanford Harmony or Sanford Inspire. All of our webinars are recorded and we will share a link where you can watch them at any time. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our speaker, Elizabeth Cook. Elizabeth Cook is a Senior National Advisor for Social Emotional Health at the Alliance for a Healthier Generation. A school psychologist by training, Elizabeth spent over a decade in the field before moving into the roles of school mental health and then school psychology consultant at the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction. In that capacity, Elizabeth led several projects related to school mental health, including Wisconsin's Trauma Sensitive Schools Initiative, an evidence-informed multi-year approach to supporting schools in implementing and sustaining trauma-informed practices. Welcome, Elizabeth Cook.
Hi, thanks. Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, everybody, for being here today. Hopefully you can see me okay. So we are here to talk about self-care strategies for the educator. And I know webinars can be a little bit tricky in terms of interaction and engagement. And so my hope today is that we can share the space together where you get the opportunity to get some thoughts out and interact and ask questions to the extent that we can here. So without further ado, we will get started. Anytime I talk about self-care, specifically as it relates to educators, since I am one, I always like to start with this story. This happened serendipitously to me almost exactly a year ago, about a year and a half ago now, right before I was going to give a keynote on self-care. So it was really timely. And I was in the bathroom with my son, who was then not quite 3, and we were just getting ready for bed. So he was on his little stool, you know, he's got his tiptoes on, he's leaning over the sink, and he's brushing his teeth. And I happen to be wearing this shirt that is on the screen right here. And he says to me, "Mom, why is the bird on your shirt so angry?" And so I did that thing that you're supposed to do as a parent, right? When you both don't want to or can't answer a question, right? And inspire that creative thinking at the same time. So I turned the question back on him and I said, "I don't know, Elliot, why do you think the bird on my shirt is so angry?" And this is what he said to me. Now, let me give you a little bit of background about my children. I have 2 of them. My son is 4, my daughter will be 2 next week. And we are in a great place of privilege where we can send our kids to this really high quality childcare. They are wonderful, they are evidence-based, they are warm and loving, and they love my children to the point where we actually call them our third parents because they interact with and parent my kid, you know, with the same love and attention that my husband and I give our children as well. A little bit of context. About 2 days before I had this conversation with Elliot in the bathroom while he was brushing his teeth, I had gotten an email from the director of the center, and she had shared with us that a beloved teacher in their center was going to lose her battle with cancer. She had been fighting it for several months. It was a recurrence, and the doctors were saying that she was in her final stages of life. And so I did the thing that you do when you're a school psychologist, right? And sort of a helicopter mom and care very deeply about the well-being of educators and just humans in general. And so I emailed her back and I said, you know, "I'm really sorry about this. This is really terrible. You know, we're sorry to hear this. And what can I do for you? And what are your plans in terms of self-care for your staff?" And I offered some suggestions. I said, you know, I'm a school psychologist. I'd be happy to sit down, right? Take a day and just sit in the office and receive folks. I am in a position where I can take a day off. And so I'm happy to have my kids stay at home with me. And I'm willing to take like 2, 3, maybe 4. I'm a school psychologist, so I can't do children in large groups, right? But 3 to 5 is a solid number for me. And so I said, I'm willing to take a couple of extra kids too if you need to close the center for services. Tell me what you need and tell me how I can be helpful to you. And she responded back to me very graciously. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. We appreciate your thoughts and feelings on this. But we're a really resilient center. We've been through a lot of things. And it's true, they have been through a lot of things. And she said, we're going to be okay. We have this. And 2 days later, this is the conversation that I'm having with my not yet 3-year-old. The point here is that it's not as if they weren't a resilient center. Like I said, that was true. They've been through a lot of different types of things, deaths of other family members, deaths of other students, and they have always rallied, right? Always rallied. It's not that they weren't resilient, right? Being resilient and needing help are not opposites, right? It just means that this particular one was heavier than I would expect it to be, right? Or that they expected it to be, right? Or maybe this was just one heavy thing in a series of heavy things. But either way, right, when you walked through the halls of that space, you could feel it, right? You could see it. You could see the forced smiles, right? You could see the staff on the brink of tears. You could read it in the short emails that they were sending or the short notes that they were sending. And so what I'm trying to say, and what I was trying to say to them, is that just because it's heavy, right? And so just because someone carries it well doesn't necessarily mean that it's heavy. And then if my almost 3-year-old can notice it, you absolutely need to believe that a 5-year-old can notice it, an 8-year-old can notice it, a 12-year-old can notice it. So what I'd like to invite you to do right now is a little bit of an activity. And this is going to be one that you can do just in your chair. So find a place where you feel comfortable, where you feel good. And if you want to, sort of close your eyes and relax. And I want you to think about the place where you feel like you are your most authentic self, right? The place where no matter what you're doing or who you are with, right, you feel totally alive, and that the people who are with you, right, know you and see you and love you for exactly who you are. So take a minute and imagine that place. Imagine what it looks like. What are the sounds you hear? Who's there with you? Who's present in that moment with you? What are you doing? And what I'd like you to do is when you feel comfortable, open your eyes and share your answer in the question box. What came up for you?
I have answers pouring in, Elizabeth, and
Oh,
I
good.
have
I can't see them.
somebody saying at home. They feel very comfortable at home.
Good, at home.
Driving and singing in my car,
Me too.
camping with my husband, being with my family, spending time with family, dancing, kayaking, just being out with friends at the beach, snuggling with their son. We have tons of answers coming in about family, scrapbooking, retreats, vacations.
Hey, Erin.
Awesome. Yes,
Is anyone saying work?
not one that I see at all.
I feel like my most authentic self at work.
Nope.
So I want you to take that moment for a minute and recognize the fact that when we are thinking about the place and space where we feel our most comfortable self, the majority of us don't say work. And we're going to talk a little bit about why that's important and how we can leverage that feeling that you have right now, thinking about the place that you love the most, and bringing that energy into a workspace where you should never feel necessarily like your most authentic self, right? Because it's work, and so that may be too lofty of a goal. But you should not feel like you're losing yourself. And that's really what we're going to talk about today, is how to set this up so we feel like we're still staying within our integrity, still being our own authentic self within our life and our jobs. So as Erin said at the beginning, I work for Healthier Generation, and at Healthier Generation, we're on this mission to empower kids to develop these lifelong habits. And we do that by ensuring that the environments that surround them support their physical, social, and emotional health. And for me, as an educator, as a parent, as a human, when I think about that, I think about the environments that our kids live in, right? Are the spaces in which they live and laugh and love, which includes school, out of school time places, right? Where adults that are not their primary caretakers love them and see them for who they are, in the same way that my children are loved and seen for who they are at the daycare center that they're at. So we are trying to make this come alive for schools through something called the RISE Initiative, which we do in partnership with Kaiser Permanente, where we're really focusing on building student and staff resilience. And so what you're going to see today is a snippet of the resources and support we have available. This is actually part of this series. We've got more strategies around self-care than you'll see today. So if you're interested, you'll get some more information about how to access the RISE Initiative. But for the purposes of today, we've got some intentions, and I call them intentions intentionally, if you will, because really they're not objectives or outcomes. This is just what our goals are for today. So my intention to you is to try to explain burnout as a phenomenon and as a cycle. And then we're going to talk about the ABCs of well-being. And then from there, we'll do some concrete steps in terms of plan development. But really what today is about is exactly what's on this screen. I had this really interesting experience. I'm not really a yoga person, but I'm trying really hard. I have growth mindset around yoga. I've yet to be a yoga person, but I'm still trying hard. And I had this experience recently where a yoga instructor was talking about the poses, and they said, you know, Elizabeth, you shouldn't conform to the pose should conform to you. And I thought that was like one of the most fascinating things I have ever heard in regards to yoga. And to me, it clicks with self-care as well, right? You should not conform to a self-care ritual that does not fit you, that is not authentic to you. If you're not a yoga person, don't do yoga. If you don't want to run a marathon or get a massage or take several deep breaths or meditate, we can talk about the evidence around those things. But at the end of the day, it has to be useful and effective for you. So to me, self-care is like a good pair of jeans or a good pair of shoes, or I guess a yoga pose, in that really it should be something that you feel comfortable and that fits you, and you shouldn't have to work hard to fit it. So that's being said, let's get into the meat of burnout and explain burnout. So this definition of job burnout comes from the Mayo Clinic, and what I really like about it is that it really talks about this whole idea of job burnout being special. And I think that matters because when we talk about burnout kind of in this global sense, it's really different. Like me being burnt out with the chores that I have around my house, right? Or parenting is a different kind of burnout than one that I feel when I'm at work. And the two specific things that are around job burnout are this reduced sense of accomplishment, right? So this idea that no matter how hard I try, I'm not getting what I need or what I want. I'm not feeling successful or satisfied in my accomplishments at work. And this loss of personal identity, right? So again, when we talked about where you feel like your most authentic self, I can't speak for you all on the call today, but I can speak for myself as a person who's been through the burnout cycle a couple of times. I can talk about that sense of personal identity, right? Where you're sitting in those meetings and you're like, what is happening here? What is this place? Who am I in this place? And these things that I'm saying, right, do not align with what my core values are. What happened to me? And that's that loss of personal identity that really fuels job burnout. So we are going to watch a video here that explains it much more authentically and profoundly than I can, by Laura Vandelutnitsky, who wrote a great book called Trauma Stewardship. Sorry, that's the wrong one. She wrote a great book called Trauma Stewardship. She also has a TED Talk with which this is pulled from. I highly recommend watching it. It's about 17 minutes in length. We are going to listen to her talk about this in about 4 minutes.
I know that all of you have so much more insight and personal awareness than I did back in the day, and that for those of you who know what this toll is and when you feel this toll, either because of what's going on in your personal lives or on the job, that you're able to identify it. But I was not at all able to identify it. So it was about 10 years into my career when a critical mass of people started kind of getting up in my face doing that, hey Laura, you're tripping, you should take some time off. And I'm sure somebody said something earlier than 10 years in, but I was very stubborn and successfully ignored them. But 10 years in is when there was a critical mass of people up in my grill really begging me to look at this. And what some of you will appreciate is that a number of those people were clients I was serving, which you can imagine is always so disconcerting. You know, survivors of domestic violence living in a shelter who can't go anywhere, begging me not to come to work. So people were doing their due diligence, right? But at the time, I was so arrogant, I was incredibly cocky, and I was entirely self-righteous. I was doing God's work. You could either step up and help me do God's work, or you could step off. But I was definitely not going to have a conversation with you about how I was affected by my job. And like many of you possibly, I was raised in a number of traditions that implicitly and explicitly communicated, if you care enough about what you're doing, if you are down with your cause enough, if it matters enough to you, you're going to suck it up. So this whole conversation about how to sustain was not something I was engaging in. But finally, the pressure mounted. I caved. I didn't take any significant time off, but compromised. We took a short trip, went to visit our family who lived in the Caribbean. So on a particular day, we head out as a family on this hike, and we get halfway through our hike, and we summit what we wanted to summit, and there we are standing on the top of these cliffs, right? So the family's gathered around, tiny Caribbean island, standing on the top of these cliffs, looking out. The first thing I remember thinking was, this is so beautiful. The second thing I immediately thought was, I wonder how many people have killed themselves by jumping off of these cliffs, right? And at the time, I worked at Harborview Hospital, which you know is the level 1 trauma center for the whole Northwest. So it wasn't my own suicidality at play anymore. It was because of the years of bearing witness to others' suffering that naturally, instinctually, one starts triaging, of course, right? So you start thinking, where would the helicopter land? Does the helicopter land on the cliff, and would you belay down to the person on the beach? Would the helicopter actually land on the beach? Is there a level 1 trauma center in the Caribbean, you ask yourself? Do they fly you to Miami? Would they stop you in customs? You know, you kind of go through the whole thing, right? So I said this out loud because I was merely presuming I was just giving voice to inevitably what was going to come up in a family conversation, because who stands on top of a cliff and does not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is? But apparently in my family, nobody was thinking that. So it got even quieter than it had been. Really long, very uncomfortable pause happened. And ultimately it was my stepfather-in-law who said, are you sure all this trauma work hasn't gotten to you? And honestly, this was the first moment I had any insight into, check it out. There are people who can go on a hike and not wonder where the nearest level 1 trauma center is. But I'll tell you, it wasn't me, it wasn't anybody I was hanging out with, right? Because one of the things about this toll is it's slow moving. It is very hard to gauge over time, individually and collectively, if we are being affected by what we're exposed to. And also what happens is we get very isolated. So this was one of those moments that maybe you've had where kind of everything starts flooding in, right? And then I was like, whoa, well, if this is the case, maybe it's also the case that there's people who still date out there in the world, and those people who date aren't doing background checks on everybody they date, right? Maybe there's people who can go to a playground. It's just a lovely place for children. You're not worried about like head injuries or Amber Alerts, right? So, but this is what happens, that over time, what you're exposed to affects your entire worldview.
So that's this idea, right? And when we are educators, when we're in the service of children, right, when we care about children as deeply as the daycare providers that care for my children do, and as I did when I was a school psychologist, and as you do as an educator, right, you take on the energies of those students, right? You care about them and you care about their families, and your success and their success are intertwined, right? So the important thing about what we just learned about or just heard about is this idea that burnout is slow moving, right? And it is super hard to engage individually, whether we're being impacted by it. And also importantly, and we won't get too much into systems level stuff today, but we do in the larger training, collectively, a system can be burnt out and in the cycle of burnout and not realize it also and be taking its staff along with it. So we are going to talk about burnout as a cycle, right? Because it comes in a cycle, in a segment that I like to call the cycle of burnout as told by a toddler. This is my daughter, Juliana. Like I told you, she will be 2 next week and is every bit of 2. And so if I understand the cycle of burnout as it relates to parenting, this is a good time and space and place for me to talk about that. The first set of the cycle is enthusiasm, right? This is the time, whether you're new to your career or you're new to your role or you're new to your job, right? Where you're like, yes, I am here, I am arrived, I have lots of really great thoughts and ideas, and I'm going to change the world, right? And it doesn't matter where you're at in your career, right? So whether or not you first graduated from college or from grad school and you're in that first job, or whether or not you've starting a new job or a new role within the same system, right? There's that sense of enthusiasm, that sense of, yes, I'm going to make a difference here. And then you realize that your job is also full of other people, and those people have thoughts and feelings and ideas and systems that have policies and practices that don't necessarily align with your thoughts, feelings, and what you think policies and practices are. So you start to get a little bit irritated, right? That idea of like, kind of rolling your eyes and huffing and puffing and starting to make a little bit of those side comments. Generally speaking, you still feel like you're doing okay, but there's just those things that start to grind on you. And if that goes unmitigated, then you move into full-on frustration. This is that feeling that you have where you feel like you're like beating the head against the wall, right? That idea of like, I am saying this thing over and over again and nobody can hear me. They're not listening. I don't understand what to do here. And this is when we start to see those somatic symptoms taken, right? So this idea of headaches and stomach aches, feeling chronically fatigued, right? Waking up in the middle of the night with that idea of like, oh my gosh, there's so many things to do. And if that goes unchecked, then you move into apathy because the brain can only feel frustrated for so long, right? You can only give up that amount of energy and that amount of stress for so long before you turn into full on apathy. And apathy is sometimes known as the zombie phase. It's a really interesting balance where you both feel like nothing you do is good enough, yet everything that's on your plate is important. So it's this overinflated sense of importance combined with the fact that the thing that you're doing is not making the impact you want to make. So this is when, right, when you wake up in the middle of the night as you do in the frustration phase, you're like, oh my gosh, I need to send that email right now. And if I don't send it, something really terrible is going to happen because the entire fate of this one particular thing rides on me sending this email at 2:15 in the morning. The challenge is that the only people reading those emails at 2:15 in the morning are other zombies, right? People who are also in the apathy phase. So you can only be in these phases for so long before you are called to take action. Your brain will force you to take action. And often you take it in sort of extreme ways, right? The most common way to take action in the cycle of burnout is to find a new job. So you say, you know what? This job isn't working for me. I'm going to take a new job. I'm going to take a new role. And you find yourself in the phase again, right? I always like to talk about it as like Lucy and Charlie Brown in the football, right? So you're like, okay, you're Charlie Brown and Lucy's got the football, and this time is going to be different. And this time she's going to let you kick it. And then what happens to Charlie Brown? This is how the cycle of burnout goes over and over again. And so what we want to talk about is not that you'll never be frustrated at work or stressed at work or irritated or sometimes feel like you're not giving enough or doing enough, right? Those are all normal, natural feelings. What we want to talk about is how to notice those pieces so that you can say, I'm not going to cycle here, right? I'm going to go left and leave instead of go right and wind it in again. So Ross Greene, if you're familiar with Ross Greene, he has an amazing website called livesinthebalance.org. And he has this phrase, kids do well if they can. I like to extend that to say people do well if they can. Nobody wakes up. I guarantee you nobody on this call right now is woken up going, you know what sounds great? I'm going to go to work and I'm going to be frustrated and crabby and walk out of there not feeling like I did the best job, right? Nobody does that, right? Because we want to do well. But we got a lot of stuff on our plates, right? We've got classroom demands, we've got new curriculum, right? We've got social emotional learning and social emotional health, we've got mental health issues, we've got the needs of the people that we care about so much, right? Our students, our families, our colleagues. And then presumably the rest of you have other stuff too, right? Families and partners and friends and hobbies, right? Things you like to do, the things that make you feel like your most authentic self. So what I like you to do right now is take a moment. And we're going to do a similar activity that we did before. So I want you to kind of settle into your desk or your seat or your chair, wherever you're at right now. If you feel comfortable, close your eyes. And I want you to think about one work-related demand that you're juggling. It could be something that you're juggling moderately well, not very well, very well. But I want you to really think about that. Think about the tasks that are around that and surround that, right? Think about the people that are there to help support you, and maybe the people that are there that are less than hopeful. And when you have that thought in your mind, I want you to take a minute and just share your answer in the question box. What's on your plate right now?
All righty, we have some answers coming in. Scheduling, time management, grading student growth, objectives, kids who are being abused and neglected, schoolwork, a lot of scheduling,
Yeah.
motivating traumatized students, internship programs, materials development, parenting,
Yeah.
paperwork, paperwork,
Paperwork, paperwork, paperwork, right?
secondhand trauma.
Yeah.
We have many more coming in with deadlines, committee responsibilities.
Yeah. You've got a lot of stuff, right? And what I want to talk about is this idea that those things that you labeled, right? Parenting and supporting students who have experienced trauma and paperwork, capital letters, 16 exclamation points, or all these external expectations, right? The things that you're expected to manage and handle within the function of your job and then also within your life, right? But this idea of how we're feeling and how we get through the cycle of burnout and how we are within the cycle of burnout is actually a combination of two things. It's the external expectations that are placed upon us, and then our internal expectations of who we want to be, right? How we want to show up that also push on that. And when those two things are out of balance, right? We feel a sense of loss of control. We feel a sense of loss of purpose, right? And we feel like we're moving away from that place where they're our most authentic selves. Part of, if you really think about it, when we feel like our most authentic selves are a place where we know, understand, and appreciate the external expectations of us, and those external expectations align with our internal expectations. So if I like a hike, for example, someone had said that, right? The external expectation is that they have a trail and it's marked and there's a map and I can go and do it. And my internal expectations are that it may be hard or difficult, right? And then I'm going to persevere and I'm going to overcome. And as that matches, I get this sense of accomplishment. It's when those things are out of balance in one way or another is where we fall into problems, right? I'll give you a personal example. I am a little bit of a recovering perfectionist, and I can feel my anxiety rise when the external expectations get in the way of me feeling like I can do my job exactly well and exactly right. Like, for example, when at the prep for this webinar, they asked me to turn off all of my things, and I thought that I turned them off, but then my Skype apparently was still on in the background, and it started to ding while I'm in the middle of talking, right? That causes me internal angst, internal anxiety, because I couldn't meet the external expectations or my internal expectations of saying that I had everything absolutely perfect prior to coming on this webinar. So what do we do about that, right? So what did I do when my Skype started to ding? So the American Institute of Stress has what they call the ABCs. It's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and it's awareness, balance, and connection. So awareness of yourself, of your systems, of your colleagues, finding balance through boundaries and through good self-care, and then connecting through gratitude and through effective complaining. Today, we're going to talk just a couple of strategies underneath all those ones, but know that there's more to come there. So the first step is awareness. So I want you to think for a second about that first exercise, right? The one that I asked you to say, like, where am I my most authentic self? So you had a thought. And what feelings did that arise for you? How are you feeling? You can go ahead and throw it in the chat box if you want to. This is a new one, Aaron. It's a curveball.
Happy, empowered, free, comfortable, calm, peaceful, safe,
Love it.
loved, centered,
Yeah.
harmonious.
And by default, I'm not in front of you, but I can imagine your behaviors or your body postures changed, right? You feel more relaxed, your heart rate naturally settles in, right? Maybe you don't grasp your pen as much as you feel like you should. You know, maybe you don't tab over to that other tab and start diligently working on emails or whatever that thing may be, right? So the thoughts drive those feelings, which in turn drive your behavior. And it doesn't really matter the entry point of them, but the point is that positive feeling or that positive thought or that positive action begets positivity across the board. Now, conversely, when I asked you to think about the place in which you're feeling a little bit stressed from work, what feelings arose for you? Go ahead and put them in the chat box. I keep calling it the chat box, the question box. I'm a Skype person.
Overwhelmed, stress, frustration, anxiety, a lot of anxiety.
So much anxiety. Not enough Xanax in the world to combat the anxiety.
Confused. Freaked
Yeah,
out.
freaked out. I like that one. So the point is that the feelings that arise are different because the thought was different. And I'm not in front of you, but I would imagine, because I've done this in front of other audiences before, that you can see a physical change in your body, right? Your heart rate starts to accelerate. You start to get into that stress response mode, which is natural, right? Someone earlier had mentioned this idea about supporting traumatized students, right? And when we talk about students who've been impacted by trauma, what we're really talking about is that stress response pattern. Well, stress response pattern is a natural response, right, to external expectations that are coming at you and internal expectations that you aren't feel like you're meeting. Now, when we talk about toxic stress, it takes this whole other level. But for all of us, right, our stress response patterns are a particular way. So if I'm thinking about all the looming paperwork I have to do and I don't feel like I can get it done and I don't feel like it's enough, right, then my body starts to go into panic mode. So I get that elevated heart rate, I get that sweat, I get those creeping thoughts. In other words, your brain is saying to you, pay attention to me. Something is happening. Something is happening and it's not good. It doesn't feel good. It doesn't feel comfortable. It feels unsafe. It feels unsafe because it's not matching what I think should be happening in the world right now. Please pay attention to me. And I think as adults, right, we're really good with kids. I was thinking about like how often I tell my kids to pay attention, or how often when I was in the field I tell kids to pay attention. I can imagine you as educators tell kids to pay attention a lot. And what we really mean is that, right? Just notice. Notice what I'm doing. Notice what I'm teaching you, right? See me, see the board, right? See the objectives or the outcomes. See this great paperwork that I just did. And your brain is saying the same thing. It doesn't want you to do anything yet. The act of paying attention is the doing, right? Just noticing that something's arising in you so that you can figure out what it is sometimes is enough just to turn the alarm bells off. To say, you know what? I see myself getting worked up about paperwork right now. I'm noticing what's happening. And all of a sudden, labeling it puts you into that cognitive space, gets you out of that stress zone. So we have a little heuristic that we use here at Healthier Generation. It's called Check Your B's. This is an awareness activity, okay? So when you think about that thing that's stressing you out at work, right, the paperwork, the supporting the students who've been impacted by trauma, think about your beliefs, right? What are you thinking? What are the thoughts that are running through your head? And what story are you telling about those, right? And it could be a story about your colleague, right? Oh, so much paperwork that I have to do, because so-and-so hasn't showed up for work in a few days and now I gotta, make up all this stuff. It could be a story about yourself, right? Oh man, I'm so bad at writing IEP goals and objectives. It takes me so long. Or it could be a story about your system, which is like, oh gosh, this is so complicated and this takes away from teaching the children. I can't believe that our principal or our district or our school board is making us do that, right? All of your thoughts and stories that you tell yourself drive how you feel and drive how your body reacts to it. So you don't have to do anything. You don't have to change it. Just notice the story you're telling. We can talk about checking for it being true or not true and showing grace to that at a different time. The second thing you do then is check your body, right? How do I physically feel and what feeling am I having? Am I all of a sudden tense? I'm a somatic person. That's just how I roll. I'm a fast processor and a fast mover. And so my body will stop me before my brain stops me, just as part of my human makeup. And so I know that I'm starting to feel stressed when I start to get weird aches and pains in my neck. Or I get like my wrists and my hands will get sore, my jaw will get really sore because I've been clenching it and I haven't realized it, right? So again, just stopping and noticing, hey, my jaw is sore right now. I must be stressed about something. Let me unpack that for a minute. And then finally with behavior, what am I doing? And importantly, what am I avoiding? Oftentimes when we feel like we can't meet external demands, well, we default to something that we can impact and can be really successful at. So I want you to take a moment and pause and consider. We don't have to write it in the chat box here, but if you had a piece of paper by you and you just wanted to write this down, I want you to consider when you're stressed at work, what's the thing that you start doing and what is the thing that you stop doing? So I'll give you a practical example. I really pride myself in having an inbox that doesn't have any unread messages in it. That's like an internal expectation that I have. We can kind of unpack that one on a different day, whether or not that's reasonable. But when I'm feeling stressed, like if I have a looming project or a big deadline, what I start doing is going to my email box and sending off emails to people and watching that ticker of how many emails I have go down. And what I stop doing is thinking about that large looming project, right? And I know that about myself, so that when I see myself like avoiding something in order to get my emails done and I'm justifying it because I'm being productive and useful and responsive to my team or responsive to my colleagues, then I can say, hey, wait a minute, I must be stressed about something, right? And be able to label that. So something that we do for awareness and that maybe you can take away from this, at the end of the day, it starts tomorrow, is just start to notice. Notice yourself, check your B's, realize what you're doing and what you're not doing as a result. So the B aspect of the ABCs is balance. We are going to talk about boundaries today. Balance to me is in two forms. It comes with setting boundaries and also comes with comprehensive self-care, which we're not going to talk about too much today. I like to, as much as possible, avoid talking to people about like exercising and eating healthy and finding meaning in those pieces when we have a short amount of time together. I feel like there are many resources about that out in the world. So Brene Brown has this really great video and has this great quote that she shares. Actually, I think we have time to play it. So I'm going to play it. I was debating on whether or not I was going to play it, but I decided I'm going to because we get 100% audience view when we play the video. So you're watching it, which is good. All right, here we go.
One of the most shocking findings of my work was the idea that the most compassionate people I have interviewed over the last 13 years were also the absolutely most boundaried. Because
most boundaried.
So I'll give you a great definition of the definition of boundary that I use in the book. Boundary is simply what's okay and what's not okay. What I think we do is we don't set boundaries. We let people do things that are not okay or get away with behaviors that are not okay. Then we're just resentful and hateful. Me, I'd rather be loving and generous and very straightforward with what's okay and what's not okay. And I learned from the research. I was the exact opposite. I assumed for the first 35 years of my life that people were sucking on purpose just to piss me off. Mm-hmm. That's what I assumed. Yeah, right. Whether it was someone who worked for me or it was family member who was constantly I was always critical and judgy. And I was like, why are they choosing these things? Why are they making their choices? They should know better. And then when this thing came up from my therapist, what if people are doing the best they can? I thought, my husband had the most beautiful answer to that question. He said, I'll never know whether people are doing the best they can or not. But when I assume people are, it makes my life better. So now I think I am not as sweet as I used to be, but I'm far more loving.
It's not just some technique so that you can do that. That's really a way of being to nurture that soil of wholeheartedness.
Yeah. Generosity, to assume the best about people, is almost an inherently selfish act, because the life you change first is your own.
Love yourself.
Yeah. And so my question is big, B-I-G. Mm-hmm. What boundaries need to be in place for me to stay in my integrity and make the most generous assumptions about you? But generosity can't exist without boundaries, and we are not comfortable setting boundaries because we care more about what people will think, and we don't want to disappoint anyone. We want everyone to like us, and boundaries are not easy. But I think they're the key to self-love, and I think they're the key to treating others with loving kindness. Sustaining. You can't, nothing is sustainable without boundaries.
I had someone ask me the other day, why is the boundary section of this particular professional learning, why is it in the balance section? It seems odd to me. I don't understand the connection. And I thought about it for a while because I thought, well, I don't know. It seems intuitive to me, but I had never thought about somebody asking me that question before. And to me, the reason why, to me, it's in that balance section is because in order to find balance, right, with the internal expectations and the external expectations, in order for us to really come to center around who am I, right? Who am I at home? Who am I within my workspace? Who am I within my life? Boundaries are critical. And that we can talk about comprehensive self-care, for example, right? And the purpose of giving back to your community and finding meaning in your work and, eat, sleep, and exercise. And those things are really important. But if at the end of the day, those external expectations are bleeding into your ability to do that, right? Or takes the time to do that, then you're not going to be able to get the most out of those pieces. And so that's, to me, why boundaries are in the balance section. And so when Brene talks about these boundaries that need to be in place to stay in my integrity, that integrity piece is that place where you feel like the most authentic self, right? That's when you're fully in your integrity, when your values are shining, right? When you're ever to make that meaning. And then you make the most generous assumptions about the people who are around you. So now boundaries come in a couple of flavors, for lack of a better word. There's the under-involved boundary, often known as rigid. I actually don't care for that word. The over-involved is porous, and then there's this helpful center of boundary, which they call healthy. I struggle with this language, which is why I put it in quotes. It feels a little judgy to me. I think that there are reasons and purposes to be over-involved and under-involved, and so I think that you can be over involved in a way that's healthy and under involved in a way that's healthy. But that's a discussion for another day. So if anyone's interested in talking with me about that, happy to chat with you about that at a different time. But under involved basically means that you are not able to find meaningful connection with what you're doing, right? It's like, I need to be far removed. I need to be away from this. I can't get invested in this right now. Over involved is sort of when you're saying no all the time, right? That's the no phase. Over involved is this idea, like, I'm saying yes all the time. I'm like always in everybody's businesses. I know exactly what's happening, right? I know all the gossip, and I'm wheeling and dealing in it. Helpful is in that middle ground, right? Where we're making meaningful connections with our students, our families, our colleagues, right? Where we're feeling vulnerable and we're sharing things that are useful about our humanity that they should know, but not in a way where we're like really enmeshed and inundated in what they're doing, and not in a way where we feel closed off. And that's the gist there. And there are times and places, right? Like, I am over involved with my family and my children, right? We have very porous boundaries. If they called me right now, I probably would be like, sorry guys, I got to stop this webinar and pick up the phone. And there are places in which I am under involved, right? Where I just don't have the time and space and energy to engage with somebody. I have very rigid boundaries on airplanes. I don't like my nightmare is sitting next to the chatty person on the airplane. That is like my literally nightmare situation. And so I intentionally make myself very closed off, very unapproachable, like the whole thing. Right. And I think that there's places where we can ebb and flow, and we naturally ebb and flow. But the point is to be able to identify what those are within our own selves, so that we can work on, if we're feeling overextended, moving ourselves, right, to a little less involved. And if we're realizing that we're feeling disconnected, pushing ourselves towards feeling more connected. So how do you do that, right? How do you set compassionate boundaries? The first thing is know your yeses. A former colleague of mine, Sue McKenzie, who works out of Rogers and Health, which is a health system here in Wisconsin, she has this really great phrase that I love. And she says, when you know your yeses, your no's flow with grace. So that's that idea of, if I know what I'm willing to say yes to, then saying no to things that don't allow me to fully live that yes becomes a lot easier, right? So if I know that picking up my kids at 4:30 is my yes, right? I have to leave her at 4:30. Then when someone tries to schedule meetings for me at 4:45 or 5 o'clock, it's very easy for me to say, you know what? Can't do it. I got to pick up my kids. Now, it's easier in some ways than others, right? But generally speaking, the more we can identify what our yeses are, what our values are, the easier those no's can flow with us. And the less we feel uncomfortable going like, oh, well, I don't know, maybe this time I can make an exception. And now I'm texting my husband saying, can you pick up the kid again for the like 15th time in the last 2 weeks, which is, I've been in that space before. The second piece is around being proactive, right? So this is just the idea of telling people what those boundaries are outright. So keeping with our meeting example, if I have on my calendar, if I share with folks, hey, I leave 4:30, hard stop to get my kids, people know that, right? So then I'm being proactive. And also be direct. So being proactive is not the same as being direct. Being proactive just means that you tell people ahead of time, right? Being direct means being firm around, no, I have a hard stop at 4:30. I cannot do this anymore. And what happens is when we're not direct, we get a little wishy-washy, right? Like, oh, 4:30-ish, plus or minus 10 minutes. And people don't know where those boundaries are. And if they don't know where those boundaries are, then we can't expect them to keep them for us. Taking action is the hardest part, I think. This is when people violate your boundary, you sharing with them that they did that in a way that helps move the conversation forward and hopefully where they don't do it again. I say this a lot because I believe it to be true, but I know that's maybe not the nicest thing to say. And that is the person who's responsible for holding your boundaries is you, not your colleague, not your friends, not your partners, not your children. My children couldn't hold a boundary if I paid them for it. It's you. And so if you have a person who's chronically crossing a boundary and you can't or talk to them about what that is, and they keep doing it, then it's unfair to that person for you to get frustrated with them, right? Or to talk about them with another colleague, right? It's only fair to do that after you've tried to address it for a while. And then the last thing is extend understanding and gratitude. So recognizing the fact that you may have a boundary, but other people may have a different boundary there. I'll give you a practical example. I have a really an old colleague of mine, really good friend, who's like a texter, and she's like a person that like I have a thought and it needs to like get out and be texted, regardless of the time of day or the day of the week. I try to not work on the weekends or after my job or whatever else. I try to set that boundary. But I know that about her, right? So when she would text me on a Friday night at 9 o'clock, right, or on a Saturday morning, I learned this, it took me a while, right? My response would be to remind her, right, that I understand that that's an important thought to her, but I don't want to answer that right now. Thank you for the thought. Please send that to me in an email. I'll check it on Monday. And it literally took me almost a year to get to that point. So I'm not trying to say it's easy here, but the point is that you thank them and understand the fact that their boundaries and your boundaries don't match and don't necessarily have to match. And so you share that with them and then thank them for agreeing to your boundary. So we're gonna do a quick activity here. It's a sentence grounding activity. So it's I will say yes to, others may not. I can ask for, and I will guard my time and energy by doing this. So if you're at a desk, grab a sheet of paper, scrap paper, throw up a Google form, whatever you use, what's your preferred style to take notes. And we're just gonna take a minute to think through these activities here. So let me give you some specific examples. Here's mine. I will say yes to my team. I am very fortunate that I have a team of 6 awesome content managers who do really, really great work. And they are my yes, right? Making sure that they feel supported and empowered within their roles to do the jobs that I need them to do. And my others may not. Others may not assign work to them without checking in first because I have a understanding of the scope of the entire workload. And so others can't just randomly assign work to them. I can ask for help in managing and balancing the workload myself so that I have a better ability to delegate that. And I guard my time and energy by sending out admin updates via email on Monday. So I don't have to spend a lot of time like having meetings, explaining, emailing a bunch of times. So that is like one example of how I ground myself within my yes. So what I would like you to do, take a minute and jot some ideas down for these 4 boxes. And when you have a yes, throw it in the chat box. What's the thing you're going to say yes to?
All righty, they're coming in. One says my health.
Good. Sorry, all the other ones are good too. I sometimes feel like when you're affirming, it can sound like, anyway, it's very good. I'm glad you're taking care of your health and everybody else's yeses are good too.
Taking time to myself.
Yeah.
taking better care of myself. I will say yes to a break,
Yes, please.
paying attention to my child, to
Yeah.
delegating, social opportunities that fill my cup, travel and family time, workout, exercising, say yes to the coworker,
Oh, that's
reasonable
kind.
requests in advance.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And so think about your yes and your ask for us for help with that. So what resonates with me is the person who talked about saying yes to delegating. So I have a yes around, we use Skype for Business. We're a virtual organization. And so there's a lot of IMing that happens on the side of meetings. And I don't care for it personally. And I think it could be problematic. And so my yes is like, I'm going to say yes. My boundary is that I am not going to accept or receive IMs during meetings. But I've yet to master that skill. I'm still pretty new at it. And so I actually have an accountability buddy who will notice or ask and has no problem. I've given her permission to like interrupt. So I ask for help from her. So she'll be like, check your IMs, don't be IMing. So if you're thinking about that delegation of tasks, you're thinking about being well for yourself, something what you can ask for is who's the person who you feel comfortable and safe with to help those checks and balances for you, right? So that you've got another person in it with you. All right, the last thing we're going to focus on today is connection. We're going to talk about gratitude specifically. And there's a reason why I talk about gratitude, apart from the fact that it's a nice, happy topic. It also has a robust amount of evidence for how effective it is in a variety of ways. So I like to define gratitude a little bit for folks because I find just in my experience it gets thrown around a lot. But gratitude is actually two parts, right? The first part is just this like affirmation of goodness, right? That good things exist in the world, right? That I have a window right here and I'm looking right out it and there's a tree and the sun is coming down and it just looks beautiful, right? It's just like a good thing. And that source of goodness is often outside of me, right? I didn't plant that tree. I didn't strategically place it there. I do not have powers over the sun to make it come down in a particular way so it glows through the leaves, right? Those are all outside of myself. It's the combination of those two things that make a gratitude. So it's not only thanking people for who they are and what they do. It's like affirming that people are good and that goodness that they brought to you is outside of you and oftentimes not influenced by you. So gratitude does a whole slew of things for you. This is according to the research. It increases your feelings of connectedness, so connection with yourself, with each other, with just the earth and the world around you. It gives you this kind of sense of elevation, right? So this like floating sense of like, yeah, I feeling good right now. It brings a sense of humility to you, and the research shows that humility is really important for balance, actually. That's when you think about that zombie phase, right, and that overinflated sense of self-importance, it's the humility piece that can help to bring that down and recognize that, you know what, if I send this email at 2 a.m. or 10 a.m., everything's still going to be okay. And then a general sense of indebtedness, right? So that idea that because the world is good, I want to give back to the world, and then I receive the world back to me. Also, super important, seriously, gratitude, super beneficial. It increases happiness and life satisfaction. It increases helpful and generous behaviors, not just from you, but from others as well. It increases productivity and achievement, so it'll actually make you more, achieve more at work. It also has been shown to decrease stress, depression, and staff-to-staff conflict. And so showing gratitude and appreciation really helps go a long way in terms of conflict resolution with staff. But everyone receives gratitude differently, so we're going to do a little activity here. There are multiple ways to receive it, kind of like that public recognition. Are you like, I want it loud and proud, I want someone to do a Facebook post about it or tweet out about it? Am I a person who just likes a little note or someone to pull me to a side? Am I a person who likes to get stuff? Or am I a person who just likes to have things happen for me? My husband's an active service guy. I don't need to tell him that he's doing a good job, but he really loves it when I remember to take out the trash. I don't have to say anything. It just has to get done. And then he knows that like his like whatever personhood is appreciated. So I want you to think about what your most preferred gratitude is and throw it in the chat box.
All righty, they're already coming in. Acts of service, public recognition. Somebody else said it depends on the situation and whose the gratitude is coming from. Notes or gifts, a lot of acts of service. more acts of service, private appreciation, um, acknowledgement, helping others.
Yeah, great. So there's a way to hardwire gratitude into the system and do it well. And so as you're going back to your schools, your districts, your your places of work, think about how to really formalize this idea. And I'm going to start with the blue box, this meeting unique needs of staff. So this activity is something that you can actually do with your team or with your whole building, or with district staff or your colleagues, right? Because what happens is if the way that your administrators are appreciating you, or your colleagues or your coworkers aren't in alignment with how you receive it, they won't notice it. And so I, for example, don't particularly care for public recognition. It is not my preferred style. And so when people do it, it actually makes me feel uncomfortable. I get like a little embarrassed about it. I feel weird about it. And so that doesn't resonate with me as receiving gratitude, even though I know it like should and is supposed to. It just like, I get a weird reaction to it. So being able to do that within your systems, within your team, so that you have a good understanding of what people like to do, will help you match it in a way where people are actually receiving the gratitude that you're trying to give them. And then formalizing those opportunities so that people know exactly when to expect them and how to expect them. Being respectful of staff time, this is critical. So if you're expected to do a staff appreciation dinner and it is like whatever, starts at 6 o'clock, and no one else was in agreement about that, may not actually land as a thing with gratitude. It needs to be authentic and it needs to be ongoing. There's some common pitfalls with implementing gratitude. So there's ways that you can do it wrong, and this is really important to know. So for example, you can do it too often or too much, right? If I'm constantly expressing my gratitude to you on a regular basis, it starts to feel a little weird, a little inauthentic, and then we're not meeting that goal of authenticity. What we don't want it to do is impede our own recognition, the recognition of our own value. And so this is when we give a compliment, but it's really a criticism of us. So for example, I may say to somebody like, oh my gosh, thank you so much for, filling out that paper. I did IEP goals earlier, helping me with those IEP goals. I really appreciate it. You know how bad I am at writing those things. Now what you've done, right, is like you've like affirmed the goodness of somebody kind of in relation to something that you think is bad about you, and then it doesn't land for anybody, right? Because that person feels uncomfortable and you feel like you're telling your story. So when we talk about checking your B's, right, you end up telling yourself a story about you not being good at something, which no one ever feels good about that. So gratitude can help with conflict resolution, but it can't replace it. So you can't sit in a circle with someone that you're mad about or having a conflict with and just like do a back and forth of how great you all are. Like, no, you're great. No, you're great. No, I appreciate this. You won't get anywhere there. Like conflicts have to be resolved in a way that is useful. It's just that extending gratitude, particularly at the back end of conflict resolution, can help move the relationship forward. And then the last one is not being mindful of power differences, right? So how people give and receive gratitude depends a lot on kind of how they identify, whether or not they're a supervisor or a supervisee, whether or not they feel like they belong in general because of who they are and how they identify. So that's it. So now you're ready to put it all together, develop a plan. My best advice is that this Voltaire quote, which I love, which is the best is the enemy of the good. And the whole idea behind this is that self-care is not about perfectionism. It's just about tiny steps to making those changes and doing the things that you want to do and walking away going, you know what? I did the best I could today. Maybe compared to yesterday, it was better or worse, but I'm not thinking about that. What I'm thinking about is how I did it today. So if you're interested in more resources and more information on this, we actually have an assessment called the RISE Index for Schools and Districts. It goes through a variety of topics, but one of them is around staff well-being and the well-being of your systems, both at the school level and the district level. And we'll give you resources and supports around all of those questions, and also this topic, along with all the expanded areas of this topic, will be available as kind of like a series of micro learnings set in a curriculum. We are also fortunate to utilize Sanford Harmony and their resources. So they have some great resources for students that actually work really well for adults too. So things like I've Got Your Back, right? Or using the Feelings Thermometer poster and setting up relaxation corner within your lounges are things that can be really useful for kids, but also for you as adults as well. If you're not familiar with the Greater Good Science Center, it is like my favorite place on the planet. They have, other than myself, obviously HG and Sanford Harmony resources, they have some great stuff, evidence-based on gratitude and just general feelings of happiness. So what I want you to do in the last minute here is think about kind of the things that we went through today. And I just want you to think about the one thing you're going to try. What are you going to try tomorrow? What are you thinking about? And then on your own, think about who's that accountability buddy going to be. So go ahead and throw your answer in the question box.
All righty, setting boundaries, creating balance, power down my phone so I don't feel the need to respond.
There's some interesting research on that, actually, Erin. There's really interesting research that taking phone breaks aren't actually breaks. They're not neurologically breaking for your brain. So that's a really good one.
Awesome. A lot of awareness and just having gratitude, checking the B's, setting boundaries, a lot of accountability. Yeah, a lot of
Awesome.
just setting boundaries.
Yeah. Well, thanks everyone so much for your time today. I hope this was useful for you. I always like to leave with this quote from the great philosopher Mick Jagger, who once said, "You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you just might find you get what you need." And our hope here at Healthier Generation, Sanford Harmony, Kaiser Permanente, is that you get what you need when you need it, as you need it. So please feel free to connect with me on Twitter or email me, join us at our website there, and hopefully we'll talk again.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth, for a wonderful webinar. Very engaging from the responses in the question box. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get all of the responses, but a lot of great engagement. So we appreciate you coming on today and sharing with us. And everybody else, we thank you as well for joining us today and taking time out of your day to join us live. Now, I want to go ahead and move on to closing the webinar. Again, thank you all. Thank you, Elizabeth. Any last words for the audience before we close out?
No, I just want to thank you all over at Sanford Programs and the audience for your great participation. And like I said, I hope you got something. Please don't hesitate to reach out. Oh, and Erin will give you a survey. Please fill it out because that's how things get better. So if you like it, tell us what you liked. But if you didn't like it too, tell us what you didn't like so we can make those improvements and adjustments.
Yes, definitely. And once this webinar comes to a close, a survey will launch on your screen. It'll be very short, and we greatly appreciate your feedback. We do read the feedback and take your responses seriously. It does inform us on how we can build more successful webinars for you all. Next month, we are thrilled to have Dr. Mary Kanaj present our next webinar, Culturally Responsive Learning Environments, which will be held on October 22nd at 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. And with that being said, thank you again, Elizabeth, and thank you all for joining, and we look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day.